Thanks so much for having me on, Mira. My name's Simon Cataldo. I now serve as the state representative in the 14th Middlesex District in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. And that district includes part of Acton, all of Carlisle, part of Concord, and part of Chelmsford. And so I represent the constituents of that district in the legislature. We pass laws, we do constituent services, we advocate for budget priorities that support not only the needs but also the values of the people in that district. In addition to that job, I'm a husband of my wife Jessie and a father of three young sons.
And before your career as the state representative, you were a lawyer. So what kind of law, can you explain what kind of law did you practice and kind of how did you decide to enter that field?
I started my law career educationally, at least, as a student at the University of Virginia School of Law, which was a great place to go to law school. I'd highly recommend it to anybody who's considering. It's in Charlottesville, Virginia. Um, for 1 year after graduation, I was a law clerk for a federal appellate court judge in the First Circuit Court of Appeals, which has jurisdiction over New England and Puerto Rico. So I worked there for a judge, Judge William Kayada, for 1 year. And then following that, I went to the Justice Department. I entered through something called the Department of Justice Honors Program, which takes people either straight from law school or from a clerkship or some kind of fellowship into trial attorney positions at Main Justice. And so I went there after that clerkship, directly from that clerkship, and worked in what's known as the Public Integrity section of the US DOJ's Criminal Division. And that is a small section of about 30 trial attorneys that focuses exclusively on public corruption. And it's different than a lot of other federal prosecutorial offices in that there's no limits to its jurisdiction. So it's a specialty section based in DC that investigates and prosecutes cases all over the United States.
That's really interesting. And did you know from the start that law was what you wanted to pursue, as a kid?
I first thought that I might want to be a lawyer and specifically a prosecutor when I was in college. And I had kind of stumbled upon an internship opportunity at the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. And at that office, I was assigned to work for the Internet Crimes Against Children prosecutor. That was hard work. It was certainly very heavy work, but I just remember having the opportunity to go to court with my boss, Dana Lachese. She was the prosecutor who led that section at the AG's office. And I would watch her argue. In particular, what I remember is the sentencing hearings, and argue for stiff sentences for individuals who had been uh, convicted of very serious internet crimes against children. And I just saw her as somebody who was doing such honorable and admirable and very difficult work. And I thought that's something that I wanted to do at some point. And it took a long time for me to get to a career actually prosecuting from there because I ended up joining Teach for America after college. I first of all, I majored in environmental science, and then I taught math in Harlem, New York City with Teach for America, and did that for 3 years before going to law school.
Wow. So were you ever thinking about environmental law or something relating to that?
I was really am interested in environmental science,
Hmm.
um, but environmental law was not something that I was as kind of intellectually interested in. I just kind of leaned more towards prosecution
Hmm.
when it came to law, constitutional law, and prosecution. And environmental law is largely statutory and regulatory.
Yeah. And when you think about the job of being a prosecutor, what would you say are the most important skills that you used in that job? And how do you think you develop those or other people can develop those?
So I think um, I'll share with you what the chief of my section shared with me very early on in my tenure. there, and it was during the occasion for this meeting was that I had been assigned a case, and um, I recommended in that particular section, um, when you decide to open a case, it's a big deal. And you go through a number of approvals just to administratively open a case. And so sometimes a lot of work and research and investigation can go into a case before you even decide to open it. And I did a lot of that work on this particular investigation. That involved a public official, and I recommended that we not open an investigation. And this was in I think, a one-on-one or two-on-one meeting with the chief. And um, it can be a serious decision. It is a serious decision to decline to pursue an investigation when you know that something happened that may not have been totally on the up and up, but you have other concerns about the case that makes you think that it's not appropriate for a criminal investigation. Because even the fact of an investigation can have a very serious effect on the person being investigated and also third parties, in addition to the significant use of resources of taxpayer dollars and the people that need to spend their time investigating this type of activity. And the chief said, the number one thing that I want in my trial attorneys is good judgment. And so I think that I'm not sure if it counts as a skill, but that characteristic of prosecutors is essential, because a good prosecutor, really, I think the mark of a good prosecutor is that they know when to charge a case and when not to charge a case, based on the evidence and the circumstances. There are a lot of other things that go into good prosecution, and good prosecutorial ability. And there are a lot of prosecutors who are incredibly skilled. They have great courtroom skills, they have great oratory skills, they have great writing or investigatory skills. But if you're not using those cases or those skills, if you're not using those skills to pursue just cases, then you're really not performing a public good. So I think it all starts with judgment, and everything else kind of flows from that.
Yeah, for sure. And what would you say are some of the most fulfilling parts about being a prosecutor?
The process of pursuing justice um, is very fulfilling. And when a case is over and you've taken it to completion and you've achieved the result that you think is just, that's pretty hard to match. Now, um, that always comes with mixed emotions. And even when I was a prosecutor, the cases that I think objectively one would think were the most successful can also be very sad. Because at a sentencing hearing, for example, you may be hearing from victims. And it's also not a happy day when somebody who's broken the law gets sent to federal prison for a long time. That's not something to be celebrated, in my mind.
Mm.
Um, it's part of our justice system. And so it's different than perhaps a civil case where you win a trial and your client gets paid $10 million. In this scenario, you might win a trial and somebody is sent to prison for 5 years, and the victims have some sense of justice, but their lives are not being made whole.
Mhm. Yeah, the second part of my question was going to be what are some challenges about that, but definitely like that must be really difficult, like being on both, like winning but not totally winning a case. And yeah, kind of like switching gears a little bit, could you talk a little bit about what inspired you to kind of change paths and then run for state representative?
Sure. So when we moved back from Washington, D.C. to Concord, where I live now, we had our second kid on the way, and COVID hit almost right away. The state of emergency was declared by Governor Baker about 3 weeks after we moved back to Massachusetts. So our re-entrance, our return, I grew up in Concord. Our return to Massachusetts was very weird.
Yeah.
And We weren't really seeing people. It was a completely unique kind of circumstance. And that was in March of 2020. And then, kind of in quick succession, we had the presidential election,
Mhm.
January 6th, George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement. It just felt like the world was changing so quickly.
For sure.
And in some senses, it felt like the bottom was falling out of everything that we had known. And right around that time, in some good ways and in some really bad ways, and right around that time, um, the state representative where we live, decided that she was going to run for higher office. And I saw that news and I went over to my wife and said, I think this is something we should think about doing. And I think what inspired that was a desire to return to public office and do something that would help our little community.
Yeah.
Because while the world seemed very online at that time, the world also seemed really small.
Mhm.
And I think, like so many other people, I felt around that time in 2020, 2021, that I had an obligation to do whatever I could to help our community and support our community. And this seemed like a good opportunity to do that.
Yeah, definitely. And has your experience in office been any different than what you expected before?
It's such a good question. And when I get that question, where my mind immediately goes is that, first of all, I really didn't know what to expect. It was
Mhm.
my first foray into political life. And in fact, as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, you have to be uh, extremely apolitical,
Yeah.
diligently apolitical. And so this really was new for me and continues to be a learning process. But people who advised me before I was elected during the campaign and before I entered office really tried to beat into me the fact that politics is very much a relationship business. It's a relationship business, yes, in the community, and that was clear during the campaign, but it's also a relationship business in Boston at the State House with other leaders. And I believed that, but I don't think I fully appreciated the extent to which it's true. And that's something that really is important in terms of effectively representing your constituents. You have to have good relationships, especially in the legislature where there are 160 members just in the House alone. So none of them can do anything by themselves.
Mhm.
You have to have other people who are going to support you in your aims, and you have to find common ground, and that takes time and it takes effort.
For sure. And what are some key issues that you've been working on as your time as state representative?
Sure. So where do you want to start? I think we could. There's a lot that we could discuss. Uh, I'll take a couple, and we can take it in any direction you'd like. So we have Hanscom Airport in our area.
Mhm.
Is one of the most important airports in our region, and there's a proposal to expand the number of private jet hangars at that airport to triple it, actually. And by doing so, we'd see a very significant amount of not only private jet traffic, but consequently greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, the increases to greenhouse gas emissions are, from what I consider to be the reputable sources, predicted to far outpace all of the local efforts that we are making in Acton, in Concord, and Carlisle, and Chelmsford, and many other communities in terms of their net effect on the carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere. Um, as part of that, there have been many advocates and activists who have done everything they can in a variety of ways to try to delay and stop that expansion of private jet traffic and travel. And for my part, in consultation with them, I wrote to and submitted a formal comment to what's called MIPA, which handles the process in our state. with colleagues to ask them to reject the proposal, at least for now, until more information can be produced that would kind of meet the rules and the regulations that involve that type of process. And I also filed legislation which was included in the House version of a climate bill that the legislature is now considering to, for the first time since Massport was created in 1956, revise its enabling statute to require Massport to consider greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental effects of Massport approved or Massport driven projects. That's something that I think is long overdue and is very relevant not only to Hanscom, but really everything that Massport does here in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely one of the most like important and pressing issues, I feel like. Um, and as like a last question, what advice would you give to students like high schoolers like me or anyone who's considering a career as a lawyer or maybe in public service?
Sure. So the most important advice that I think I can give you, actually two things. So number one, don't take any one person's advice as gospel.
Mhm.
Okay, there are a lot of important perspectives, and you should solicit advice, but you don't necessarily have to follow anybody's advice. So that's number one. With that caveat, the thing that I feel the most strongly about is that you should not go to straight to law school after college. Work, work in a real job. And some people call it taking time off. You won't, it's not taking time off. It is actually the opposite of taking time off. If you go straight from college to law school, you're going to feel like law school is hard.
Mhm.
If you go from college to a rigorous job to law school, you're going to feel like law school is easy. And that
Interesting.
has been the experience of almost everybody I know. And when I was on the law review at the University of Virginia, which is more or less the top 8 to 10% of the class, I noted that most people, the vast majority of people, had taken more than 1 year to work. Um, so uh, that's been my experience. Certainly for me, the time that I spent teaching in Harlem was life changing. And I can't imagine what my life would have been like had I gone straight to law school. I certainly don't think I'd have the job I have now.